Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was January 13th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico. And this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. And this is the 20th episode, so I'm just going to take a moment in the intro here to tell you just a little bit more about what is going on in this podcast. I don't know if any of you have been listening to these episodes one after the other in order, but you really don't have to do that. This podcast is designed for people to be able to just dip into the middle, much like how a historian might open up a register of letters and just have to figure out what's going on because they're finding that they start in the middle of some ongoing story that they don't have any prior knowledge about. So this podcast is an outgrowth of my own interest in how history gets made. That is to say, how do historians look at the records that we have of the past that are oftentimes not already arranged in some kind of storytelling form? Like these letters that we've been looking at day after day. Well, some of them aren't even letters. Some of them are official charters. Some of them are rulings on petitions. Some of them are financial records. How does a historian work with all of that in order to present some kind of coherent explanation? Maybe in the form of a narrative, and maybe not so narrative. Maybe stepping back from the storytelling mode and instead getting into some overarching argument about what really caused what in a faraway time and perhaps a faraway place. So that is the interest that I am bringing to this project, and it's also the result of my own graduate work at the University of New Mexico, where there is an incredibly strong medieval studies program, not just in history, but also in English literature and history of art and music. It's a very multidisciplinary strength at the University of New Mexico in their humanities, this medieval studies. There's even an Institute of Medieval Studies at the University of New Mexico. So I was able to get some really great training and have some really amazing coursework taught by the professors there that really added to my interest in the Middle Ages and in medieval Iberia in particular. And then I also benefited from other experiences like going to some academic conferences, like the big medieval studies conference in, of all places, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and also another one that I was able to attend last year in Leeds in the UK. I've also done a few seminars. So there's a wonderful seminar series put on by an organization called the Mediterranean Seminar, and that has to do with building skills in paleography or in different aspects of what you might see in the medieval Mediterranean. So I've taken some awesome seminars through them too. And I bring all of this to bear on the way that I'm interacting with these documents, but even then, you can tell that I still feel like a beginner. So you really get an appreciation for the depth of expertise on the part of the historians who've been working with archives like these for sometimes decades. But I don't only have interest in the Middle Ages and the medieval era. I have other interests too, because my favorite subject when I was a high school history teacher was AP World History. And in that particular course, historical thinking skills are emphasized, and the scope is, as the title would suggest, global. And so I am interested in these broader questions of how history gets made in a variety of settings. So this season focuses on medieval Crown of Aragon, but other seasons are going to be in dramatically different times and places. You might be wondering how I got interested in all of this. Well, it helps that I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the University of New Mexico is located with its strength in medieval studies. But as I was thinking about my graduate work and what I would like to study, I read some of the works that the history professors at UNM had written. And one of those books I just loved so much, and it was called A Kingdom of Stargazers by Michael A. Ryan. And I talked with Dr. Ryan about medieval astrology, about Iberia, about gender, and how gender played into the role that Joan and Violant were criticized by their contemporaries. And it just really became this fun puzzle trying to figure out what was happening at the time, journeying back 600 plus years and being able to see that there's just this wealth of documentation to draw from. I was completely shocked that there was so much information in the archive from so long ago. So it just kept snowballing my interest, and as I dug more and more into it, the more fun I was having and the more interesting of a puzzle it became. So here we are in episode 20, and I hope that little check-in has been interesting and worthwhile for you to listen to. Let's move on and talk about today's document. Today's document is a really good example of how I wish I could just somehow download all of the experience and expertise from some of those historians who've been working on this for decades, because I chose the Latin document over one that was in Catalan for January 13th. And I knew going in that it was going to be a challenge because the Latin documents are way more challenging for me. But then I didn't realize just how much of a thicket of confusion I was getting into with this document. Well, it's its own joy. There's these frustrations that then are like challenges, and then you're like, oh, I just can't let go of trying to figure this out, but I can't, no matter how many angles I'm trying to use in order to figure this out, I'm not making progress. So today's document is one in which there's a person mentioned in the third line, some kind of master of religion, religious studies, maybe. The word is magistrum that's used to describe this person. It's that person's title. And there's some adjectives preceding that: the venerable, religious man, the master, and then the name. And this particular name is one that paleographically was extremely difficult for me. The reason is that it's very clear that it's a letter R, a capital letter R at the beginning. But then the next letter for the longest time I thought was an E, but actually it is a V, which was interchangeable with the letter U. And so the letters that you can see on the page are R, U, T, E, N, and that N looks like the letter Y in modern script, but it is an N. And then there's the line above the word, the person's name, and it's a macron is the paleographical term for that. And that indicates that there's some other letters in there, maybe just one extra letter. Typically, if it's just one extra letter, it's an M, but it could mean that there's more extra letters in there. So at first, I was going to the AI chatbots being like, who is reten? What is reten? And I wasn't getting anywhere. And then I looked closer and noticed that the second letter was not an E, but instead was a U. And then I went into the chatbots again and said, what is ruten? And that got me some answers that I'm just not sure if those are correct. Ruten could be the shortened form of rutensis, which is the Latin form of a town in southern France named Rodez. And there were some notable religious figures at this time in Rodez who might have had connections to the Avignon Pope. And that's as far as I got, and I don't feel confident enough in any of the ideas that came through in my Googling around or from the chatbots to say with any more certainty who this person is. So that was the most time-consuming challenge of this document, but I've kind of gotten ahead of myself because I haven't even told you yet who this document is addressed to and even who wrote it. So this is from Violant. This is written from Barcelona, of course, on January 14th. And Violant is writing to the Avignon Pope. The very beginning of the letter has suffered some damage, and so you can't quite see the honorific that's used before the PR with a curved macron. That is an abbreviation for pater, and having some kind of honorific before the pater usually means that it's the Pope that's being addressed. And then in the address line at the bottom, it's actually 3 lines long, that address line, and there's a bunch of honorifics until you get to the very end of the first of those 3 lines, and you'll see it's pretty easy to read just knowing the modern letters. Clementi with a macron, and here that macron indicates the letter N. Clementi, Clement the Seventh, the Avignon Pope at this time. I got super confused when I saw on the second line the word Romane. It's kind of in the middle of that second line. And I just went spinning out. I said, oh my gosh, is Violant also sending this to the Pope in Rome? Urban VI, the competing pope? That would be so weird. And then I went to the end of the line and I misread that. I said, oh, that looks like Italy. Italier or something like that. No, that is the letter E, a capital letter E, and then it's CC. So that is the abbreviated form of ecclesiae, like ecclesiastical. And the word that comes before it is universalis. So what we're looking at here is just a very long string of words attached to the name of Clement. And this was a way of emphasizing the status of the Pope. All of these titles are maybe being invoked in this instance because this might be one of the earliest letters that Violant is sending to the Pope after she has adopted the title of Queen. So this is all, it's not saying that there's someone else in Rome. What the address line is saying is that Clement is the true inheritor of the Roman institution that is not in Rome anymore, it's in Avignon, in the opinion of the supporters of this side of the Great Schism. They would say it's in Avignon as it should be. And so the use of the word Roman here is to further the argument that the Avignon Pope is the true inheritor of what has sometimes been called the throne of Saint Peter in Rome. So that threw me through a loop. I went down a whole misdirection on that, thinking that this was somehow a letter that was also going to go to Rome. Nope, not at all. Oh my gosh, we're already at 16 minutes and I haven't even gotten to one of the most important things about this letter. In the very first line, there's this phrase, arduis urgentibus. So, urgent, okay, it's like the English word. And then if you think of the word arduous in English, difficulties, right? There's some urgent difficulties happening. And then further in the line is the word negotiis, like the affairs. Like there's urgency, there's difficulties in the affairs that are happening, and therefore Violant needs this person to be sent by the Avignon Pope Clement to the Crown of Aragon. And I just wish I knew who this person is. If I find them later, I'm going to be so happy. Hopefully they will reappear in another document or in Joanne's register, and I'll figure out the mystery of who this person was that Violant felt needed to be sent over to the Crown of Aragon in this moment when there's some urgent difficulties. And by the way, that phrase, arduis negotiis, that was in yesterday's document too, but I forgot to point it out. So this is a phrase that's being used in order to really reveal and admit that the succession process is not going according to plan. They've run into some difficulties. What are the difficulties? Well, Joanne's illness, of course. But we're not using the word illness or sickness. We're not, in this letter, Violant would never want to reveal what the problem is, because as soon as you mention that the king is suffering a severe illness, you're throwing into doubt the succession process. And that'll just kind of have all kinds of ripple effects as that news gets out. But certainly the news is leaking out little by little because Joanne is not yet in Barcelona. One last thing to mention at the end of this episode. Violant's location, according to the documents in this register, January 13th, Barcelona. January 16th, Granollers for the big meeting. January 18th, there's a letter. The location is Barcelona. So this idea that Joanne and Violant enter Barcelona together, which I've seen mentioned in a bunch of secondary sources, it is not quite as simple as they just both arrived at the same time. Violant is going back and forth, and whatever kind of entrance the two of them make on January 19th follows a lot of back and forth that Violant is journeying to be at Joanne's side, and then back to Barcelona to make arrangements, and then to back and forth. So Violant is really moving and active. It also shows just how possible it was to make the trip from Granollers to Barcelona. If Violant can shuttle back and forth, how out of it and reduced must Joan's condition be that he needs extra time before making the journey to Barcelona? All right. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Because when you're trying to piece together a narrative out of what you're finding in the records of the past, you're never going to be fully satisfied. You're always going to be missing so much, just because not everything can be saved. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.